Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And we're starting a new week, and I hope that you are having a good day. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you're watching on, and they will show up here in my chat room. And I started today, as I do many days, wondering what I was going to talk about. And I was going through my social media and I came across an absolutely vile post, um, full of hatred and negativity. And I was sitting there thinking about this post. And the thought occurred to me, this post was all about the poster's hatred for other people. And obviously it was a political post in keeping with the emotions running around these days. But it dawned on me, that's not really about hating other people. It's really about self-hatred. Nobody is going to be that full of hatred for other people, especially other people they don't know, if they love themselves. People who love themselves don't generally have time for that kind of nonsense. And hello to Antonio Huerta in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. When we love ourselves, we may disapprove of certain things in the world. We may oppose certain things in the world, but we're rarely filled with hatred toward much of anything. Won't say nothing, but would have to be far more extreme. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. But when we hate ourselves, we're constantly looking for other things to focus that hatred on. And hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you, Michael. And I thought that might be a relevant thing to talk about. And I think that, for 10 years, we've been doing the Corellian Peace Campaign, which was all about fighting the energies of hate and fear, which I regard as being related. I come from that point of view that there are only really two emotions in the universe. One is love in the sense of divine balance, and the other is fear. And that all other negative emotions kind of come down to fear of one thing or another. I think self-hatred comes down to the difference a person possesses between what they think they should be and what they are. I think suffering in general comes down to a difference between our expectations and our reality. But I think self-hatred, and therefore generally hatred of others, comes down to having an unrealistic expectation of ourselves that we are unable to live up to, and a fierce condemnation of ourselves for not living up to it. And of course, we all know that there are certain religious and philosophical models that are based on that concept. So it's no wonder that it's running around loose in the world. And hello to Noah in the chat room. And Noah says, you in particular represent to me a sensible communion between the intellect and spirit. Thank you, Noah. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you, and hello from Western Pennsylvania. Well, thank you, Noah. Things like that are what make doing this worthwhile. And that really is what I try to be. And when we talk about the difference between what our expectations are and what we actually are, I'm certainly not perfectly a perfectly expressed aspect of spirit, but I do my best. And I try to be a sensible communion between intellect and spirit. And I try to examine when I find something isn't right. If I find that I'm not living up to an expectation. I try to change either the expectation or myself rather than taking it out on the world. But most people don't know they can even do that. They don't know what shadow work is. They don't know that you can, um, don't really realize they can change themselves. And the idea of changing their expectations is anathema to them because they've been taught that they'd be better off to die than change their expectations. And this, Ed the Pagan likes to say that Armageddon is a war crime. And I agree with that. But I also think that raising children to think that changing their worldview, that death is preferable to changing their worldview, is a spiritual crime because our worldviews constantly must change because the world is constantly changing. And granted, certain religions and philosophical mindsets insist that nothing ever really changes, but it changes constantly. And yes, we're still the same people we were before, and yet we're also not. We're constantly evolving, we're constantly growing, and we have to be prepared to do that. And, I see people these days who think it would be great to go back 200 years, and that life was just so great then because they don't have the remotest idea of what life was like 200 years ago, um, or what it would have been like to live that way. 100 years ago, even. One of the things I saw recently, um, either on YouTube or Instagram, but it had to do with historical reconstruction, which is one of the things I greatly enjoy. But they were looking at a, a working class Victorian apartment. It was a home, it was a small home, and it was a two-room home in which a family of six were recorded as having lived. And she talked about in this video what the life actually was like, and how distorted our view is because, for the most part, what is still standing from the Victorian era are mansions. And a lot of people have the false idea that everybody was living in those mansions and those large homes, when in fact they were actually living in far lesser circumstances, often in circumstances that we would condemn. If a family were living that way in the United States today, chances are that the Department of Children and Family Services would want to take their children from them. But at the time, it was considered a good life for a working class family. This is not something any sane person wants to go back to, having transcended it. And yet there are people who think they do. When we look at, I have to say the fact that measles is running around the United States today when it had been eradicated is just absolutely breathtaking to me. And why anyone has chosen to go down that path, in my mind, can only be attributed to their own self-hatred. What's happening in this country, what was explained to me several months ago as being a national suicide. And I think for a certain segment of the community, that's absolutely true. And the reason is because their expectations and their reality are so different from one another. And there is no way to make their expectations reality because their expectations are fantasy. And this is why we need to be careful about having realistic expectations. Because when our expectations are fantasy, we can never meet them. And we will always fall short. And this can tend to make us very negative when that happens. If you're absolutely convinced that doing a certain thing is going to make you prosperous, and you do it, and you end up not prosperous, and you do it again and again and again, and every time the outcome is the same, It's not because you did it wrong, you have to change your expectation or the way that you've gone about it, because something in the idea is wrong if it always fails. If the life that you think is normal is not a possibility, then it was never normal. If the life that you think is ideal is not something that anyone is achieving around you, then it cannot have been that ideal. Um, and I think that people, pardon me for just a moment, um, really need to examine their view of themselves and their ideals. And I was talking about this, I guess, last Thursday, the idea of barbecuing sacred cows. When you find that your sacred cow does not work, when you find it does not fulfill its purpose, then, metaphorically speaking, you barbecue the sacred cow and you find something else. When what you are seeking um, cannot be effectively fulfilled, then you need to change either how you're seeking it or what you're seeking. And this seems like such a simple idea, but for so many people, it's nearly impossible. Once they've adopted a certain mindset, it seems like they're willing to accept countless failures of that mindset rather than reconsidering it, rather than saying, well, I was wrong in that assumption. I need to try something else. Let me tell you, one of the greatest strengths in life is being wrong, because it means you can change your idea because you've recognized it was not the right idea and choose something more effective. Thinking you're always right is not necessarily going to pay off. Um, yes, there will be times you are right, but you'll see that in the success of what you've done. And sometimes you have to get through difficult periods to see that, I will grant you. As I look at the last couple of years, I went through a very difficult period in which I had to ask myself, did I do the right things? Did I make the right decisions? Did I choose the right people? In the end, the answer was yes. The structures that um, I had built are still standing, they're still thriving, they're still going forward. The people that I had built and advanced and nurtured, some of them fell away, others are still thriving. This is what happens in life. You can't expect that everyone will be a success, but overall, it was a success. Having said that, there were certain specific things that I had made wrong decisions about, and I must remember that. And I must accept that. And in your life, you must be willing to do that also. Um, Sometimes the person that you've chosen to trust maybe wasn't worth that trust. Sometimes what you thought was the right course of action was not the right course of action. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you then change your action once you've realized it. And Noah says, barbecue a sacred cow that you discover doesn't work. I will keep that in my heart as a useful metaphor. Good. Thank you, Noah. I think you'll find it very helpful. Um, I think one of the worst things that we do as people is that when we see repeatedly that a certain assumption does not work, we assume that we have been wrong rather than that assumption is wrong. I think that must be human nature, because I refer to certain religions and philosophical points of view, but they're not few. There are a lot of religions that are that way. So I assume it must be human nature, and therefore I can't condemn it. I can only say there's a better way. That better way is to adapt to changing circumstances and to reconsider what you believe. One of the things we talk about frequently in spirituality is why reincarnation? Why would we want to start all over and not remember everything we've already learned, or in most cases. And one of the reasons is that it does allow you to reconsider those things that did not work. It allows you to start again, even though often we do still subconsciously carry those things forward. We need to frequently reassess what we believe, to frequently change some of our assumptions if we wish to be successful in life, if we wish to be happy in life. It does us no good to cling to things that do not work. Now, that doesn't mean that you should not give everything the time it needs to develop. It doesn't mean that something may not take a long time to bear fruit. It's said that the wise man is the person who plants fruit trees that will not bear fruit until after they have died. Um, and this is certainly true, because that fruit will be very important in the future, even if they're not there to see it. But that doesn't mean that it was an impractical idea. It just means that it's going to take its time. And this can be true of things in life as well, but knowing the difference between something that's taking time and work versus something that is a foolish choice is a very important thing in life. I have taken part in many projects that took a lot of work to get going. And I have seen some of them prosper around the globe and continue prospering decades afterwards. I've seen others that prospered in their day and then passed on, which is perfectly fine. And I've seen others that failed completely. And this is what life is. No one is always going to have a success in everything they do, nor can we expect that. Nor can we beat ourselves up when we occasionally have to change plans or change techniques. That's part of being alive. And if you want proof of that, and Lady Bitterwind always told me, if you want to understand God, look at nature. If you want proof of how life should be working, look at nature and evolution. How many different species are no longer here because their day had ended and a new system was needed, because a new and often more complex creature came along. This is how life is in general. The dinosaurs were great, and they had a very, very long period in which they thrived and prospered. And arguably, they simply evolved into other life forms rather than vanishing as people often think, though certain particular species did. But generally speaking, we know today that birds are the descendants of dinosaurs. We know that many reptiles predated the dinosaurs and are still right there. So those ideas worked. Others had their day and moved on to new ideas. This is how our life is too. And we cannot allow ourselves to fall into false hatred for ourselves simply because not everything works out. Nor, and more importantly, because perhaps we were raised with ideas that didn't prove to work in the real world. Going back to where I started, that woman who posted that vile post obviously is suffering from a false illusion of what the world should be, which involves only people exactly like herself. There's never been a point, at least within recorded history, that the world was filled with people exactly like each other. I suppose if we go far enough back in prehistory to where we were all simple hunter-gatherers, there'll come a point where we were all pretty much exactly the same. But for a very long time, we've all varied greatly, even though we have many things in common. The person who hates other people simply because they're different, again, I don't think it's really the other people they hate at all. It is the falseness of their assumptions about the world, and the fact that the world will not live up to that false assumption, and the fact that they cannot meet it themselves. For us, As spiritual people, this is where shadow work comes in, because we have this like everybody else does. Being spiritual doesn't mean you're not a person like every other person. It does mean that you have tools that other people don't. When we find that we have expectations or belief systems that do not work, we can use shadow work to change them at very deep levels of our being. When we find that the world does not shape itself the way we've been taught it should, we are able to change our assumptions and to use shadow work to help that. When we find that we are not everything that we wish that we would be, we have ways to change the way we wish we would be or what we are. We can try something new. And this, to me, well, this is what evolution is all about. Whether we're talking about spiritual evolution or physical evolution, it's about trying that new next thing. I always say, do the next right thing. Find the next right thing. And sometimes this means totally clearing out your assumptions and remaking them. I spoke the other day about certain assumptions that I think the pagan community desperately needs to clear out and remake. One of them being the idea that all finances are evil. I see pagans destroying themselves constantly out of fear of money. Money is simply a marker for energy, and being constantly afraid of it is not a positive thing. Fear of organization is one of the things that's stopping us from being able to do anything in the wider world. This is something that as a community we need to reassess our view on. And it may also be something we need to assess our individual views on, because one of the reasons that people fear organization is that they believe that it would be misused because they themselves would misuse it. So I would say maybe some self-work is important in both cases with this kind of sacred cow. But, as we look at the times that we're living in, without organization and funding, we're in very desperate situations. We really need to look at how we feel about these things and adopt a healthier way of looking at them. I also mentioned consensus decision making, although I think that's largely a fad of the past. But you still encounter that idea in places. And I'm not talking about consensus. Consensus is very important. No organization or group of people is going to go very far without a shared consensus. Consensus is vital and important. And if you don't have it, everything is going to fall apart. I talked about the last couple of years, and I can tell you that as I look at the fight that I watched occur, those who had a clear consensus are the ones who won that fight. Those who did not, or who were trying to drastically change things without consensus to do so, they lost everything. Building a consensus as you go is very important, but that's not what consensus decision making is about. Consensus decision making is the idea that every person involved must completely agree on everything. That will never happen, or very rarely. There may be an exception in groups that have been together for long periods of time where everyone is very tightly bonded and very similar. However, how often does that happen? And I have watched important groups wreck on the rocks because they tried to follow that point of view, and in a moment of crisis, it failed. There are always going to be disagreements, and you have to have ways to move forward even when you disagree. As I look at things going on in the pagan community today, this is an important thing that people need to remember. We're not all always going to agree, and we have to be able to get along when we don't. If we're going to wreck the boat every time someone has a conflict somewhere, we're going to be constantly wrecking our boats. We have to find positive ways of resolving these things. And that comes back, I think, also to that issue of self love. If you love yourself, you'll find it easier to work with other people. You'll find it easier to find agreement with other people. And even sometimes to be willing to accommodate things that might not be entirely what you would choose, but are acceptable. And this is how progress is made. Things are not always perfect, and we can't expect them to always be perfect. Um, and there we are. And I see that we've come to that time for a message from our sponsors because we love our sponsors. And therefore, hello, this is Rev Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And I would like to invite you to my Don art showing and auction on Friday, May 9th, with original pieces and prints of my artwork and other interesting items with the auction at 5 p.m. on Whatnot. And please stay tuned for more announcements and examples of art that will be coming. Thank you. And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub, Corellian Publishing, and the Court of the Five Tribes, and Reverend Don's Don Art Auction on May 9th. And I hope you'll join us for that. And I hope that you are having a wonderful day. I hope you've enjoyed the program. And to all the winners of our Sunday auction yesterday, congratulations. We auctioned a number of my personal tarot decks that come from years ago, and I hope that the people who have won them will enjoy them, notably the Shul Twin Tarot and the Tarot of the Ages. And thank you, everyone, and let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we rejoice in this walk we walk together, and we ask you to help us to always find love for ourselves and our fellow human beings, and not to give in to hate, either for ourselves or for our fellow human beings. Help us to choose love over fear, and to always find and do that next right thing, beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors. We thank you with great love, knowing you are always with you, with us. We thank you for your presence, knowing we are always with you. We thank you for your presence. And may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always, and I'll see you again tomorrow.